Good evening. Welcome to Affinity's International Women's Day webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all stand. The officers of Affinity are on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. My husband and I live on the land of the Camaragal, also of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and to all descendants who have cared for this place since time immemorial. We also honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today, most especially the women. My name is Professor Mary Crock, and I am Professor of Public Law at the University of Sydney Law School. I'm also Director of the Sydney Law School Centre for International Law. More importantly, I am a member of the board of the Affinity, and I am very honoured to fulfil the role tonight of introducing everybody. We're going to begin by having a look at a short video of some of the highlights from Affinity's work in 2020.
I think as the leader of a government
with the United States is the US.
Featuring Muslim and Christians
that enhance social cohesion.
Peace operations and peace building provide hope to areas that are emerging from conflict.
What are the factors that contribute?
Trying to solve common problems.
Talk about a Human Rights Act, we tend to
must be preserved.
For those who have never attended an Affinity event before,
Affinity was formed some 20 years ago
by a group of young Muslim Australians
to promote multiculturalism and foster intercultural
and interfaith dialogue by building bridges between different groups in society.
So the warnings have been in since 1988. It's science.
Will help build the resilience of our environment to climate change.
Vulnerable parties need a court system that's flexible, accessible and adequately resourced.
And if we don't save each other and work together to save creation, then it'll all be destroyed.
Activating positive peace is generally community level.
To help make sure that every person that doesn't have a voice in this equation,
imams and other religious and faith leaders
get access to the key services that are available to them.
Generally looked upon to give advice and support.
Even if we doubled the humanitarian intake in Australia.
To all speak up about the deterioration of human rights.
In the world at the moment, you see
there's still so many displaced.
Where leadership is strong and you see where leadership's not strong and you look at the difference it makes on society.
There's a realization that the place for youth
what is impacting on decreasing,
and it is a privileged space,
peacefulness globally is attitudes.
Still a very good opportunity for you to grow as a person.
And use that positive peace framing to think about what you can do.
There is no space for hate. There is no space for bigotry. There is no space for racism.
You are wonderful citizens which are contributing to the well-being of our state.
A, in your own community.
And the example you are setting.
B, in your own family unit.
Make sure that all of us stay safe and we keep our loved ones safe.
Or see what you can do personally.
You're an example to the rest of the world about what multiculturalism means and how we can all be successful.
I have a responsibility to them.
This is the most extraordinary public health challenge,
as well as to everyone else, not just to my family,
that we have faced in 100 years. Economic, social and cultural rights are also very important.
Especially this year, it's really an opportunity where we're all in the same storm. We might be in different boats.
These conversations are so important to promote the concept of togetherness, cross-cultural collaboration and of breaking down barriers that might otherwise but should never exist.
Really putting yourself out there in the university spaces.
That we can't use ethnicity or race.
And utilising the online spaces that are provided for you.
Or religion as anchor points to be able to divide us.
Positive peace is an indication of a capacity of a country to be peaceful. Well, there isn't economic needs for why we need to have a CEO who is Indian or Chinese.
There's only limited time in the day to be able to study and balance these other things.
But there is a moral case of saying, why not?
Crucial for your professional development.
And actually, that's a really good point. 100% a contributing factor to the success.
And just being more respectful of each other would avoid a lot of these problems.
We're yet to see culturally diverse representation at senior levels.
Now, I think this should show you how hard Affinity works to bring us all together. We are gathered together tonight in recognition of International Women's Day. Affinity is proud to partner with Amnesty International Australia and the Diversity Council of Australia to bring you this event. March the 8th is a special day for women, and it began in 1908 as a labour movement when 15,000 women marched through New York City demanding shorter working hours, better pay, and the right to vote. The first International Women's Day really didn't come about, however, until many years later. In 1975, we had the UN recognise that year as the Year of Women, and the following year they recognised the 8th of March as International Women's Day. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge. And with no further ado, I will introduce tonight's facilitator, Philippa McDonald. Now, Philippa McDonald is a former senior ABC News reporter and senior journalist, one of Australia's highly respected and influential presenters and reporters. She is an author, an MC, a facilitator, a mentor, a media trainer, and she works very hard with us through Affinity. She's renowned for asking insightful questions and interviewing all sorts of people from all walks of life, from cabinet ministers to public health officials, and she is going to host tonight's event for us. So welcome, Philippa.
Thank you so much, Professor Mary Crock. Thank you for your warm welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I join you, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of course the traditional lands from where you're watching today. I would like to pay my respects to the elders of the Aboriginal community and extend my recognition to their ancestors, descendants, and leaders, past, present, and emerging, especially women. Thank you for having me along today, and happy International Women's Day. Today's theme for this discussion, discrimination and inequality, using people power to bring about hope and change. Choose to challenge. I'd like to introduce our speakers for the night, Sam Klintworth and Annese. As a long-term, passionate, dedicated human rights defender and National Director of Amnesty International since 2019, Sam Klintworth has been a resolute in advocating for rights holders on a local, national and international scale. With a career spanning 30 years, predominantly in the community and not-for-profit sector, qualifications include a Bachelor of Laws, an MBA, and certification as a registered psychologist. Sam has used her expertise to actively champion better governance and policy and challenge injustice with a particular focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals and communities. Lisa Annese has been the Chief Executive Officer of the Diversity Council of Australia since 2014. In this role, she leads debate on diversity and inclusion in the public arena, and as a result, you will have seen her on the ABC's The Drum and in wider Australian media. In 2018, Lisa was named as one of the AFR's 100 Women of Influence. In 2019, she was elected to the board of Amnesty International Australia. Lisa was also the executive producer of DCA's podcast, The Art of Inclusion. Welcome, Sam and Lisa.
Hi, Philippa. Good to be here.
Hi.
Sam and Lisa, before we begin our virtual couch conversation, I'd like to hear about the challenges both of you see for women in Australia and further abroad in 2021. Could I ask you, Lisa, to start to outline what you see as the big issues in terms of gender inequality, Lisa?
Thank you, Philippa, and thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation today. Look, I think it's a really good way to kick off the conversation because it helps us focus our attention. And as I think about what the key challenges are for women in Australia and also globally, it strikes me just how much work still needs to be done. That in Australia, even though we have one of the highest levels of educational attainment in the OECD for women and girls, on any other measure, there are huge gaps around the gender equality for women, and that includes the right for women to live free from harassment or violence. That includes the ability to have economic empowerment, to have the same, to earn equitably in comparison with male counterparts. It's also about our representation, women's representation in power, in government, in business, and it's around being able to share the responsibilities for caring and domesticity. These are all factors in which we've got a long way to go, even though we've been having conversations about it forever. But the only measure in which in Australia women have achieved equity is around education. In every other measure, we still have work to do. And if we take a global perspective, and I know Sam can probably talk about this in more detail, we can see that in other jurisdictions, things are even more serious and there's an even further way for women to go. But that's a starting point.
And Sam, what would you like to add from Amnesty International Australia's perspective?
I completely agree with the points that Lisa's raised, and despite improvements in the lives of women and girls as a result of the international women's rights movement, women in Australia and around the world continue to experience violence, sexism and misogyny. We have a long way to go in Australia in terms of challenging systems and structures. And in recent weeks, Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins have reminded us that there is still a long way to go to ensure that survivors of sexual assault have access to justice. And also the recent anniversary of the death of Hannah Clark has also reminded us that domestic and family violence remains a significant issue for us to tackle in Australian society.
Yes, well, it's increased. The figures are up in terms of domestic and family violence. 1 in 4, the staggering statistics, which are real people. I think we'll move on to that. You know, we had 56 women killed last year, yet there's patchy and slow law reform when it comes to coercive behaviour. And also, I know, Lisa, that you today launched a body of work on behalf of Diversity Council of Australia regarding tackling domestic and family violence in the workplace, called Busting the Myths. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, we did it in conjunction with Our Watch, which is the federal body responsible for, tasked with the responsibility of domestic and family violence prevention. And what we wanted to do is speak to employers, because 2/3 of all women who experience domestic and family abuse are in employment. And so workplaces have an opportunity to be able to respond to that and to provide environments that are safe, and also to be able to provide appropriate support. And I think the important thing to say is that all domestic and family violence, all violence against women, including sexual violence and sexual harassment, it all starts with gender inequality. Now, not all gender inequality leads to violence, but all violence stems from the unequal distribution of power, unequal relationships, economic disadvantage, and it crosses all classes, all cultures, all ages, and all other types of groups, all identities. So I think it's important for us to recognise how pervasive this is, and I'm very interested in what we can do to not just respond to things, in the way we want through a law and order framework, and the way we want employers to help respond, but I'm also interested in what are the things that lead to an environment in which domestic and family violence actually occur. And if we recognise that that all starts with gender inequality, then that's a starting point for which to try and create change.
Well, could I follow up there? Navigating a workplace, I mean, we hear of domestic violence leave, which is part of many awards and available in many enterprise agreements. So a lot of workplaces, but we don't hear of what's happening on the ground as to signs of someone who is suffering deeply and at risk, or someone who would be a perpetrator, because a lot of perpetrators are in the workforce. So what are you breaking open there as to what should happen, and attitudes and leadership from the top?
Well, what's important to know about domestic and people who experience domestic and family violence, just like with sexual violence, the first disclosure of that will predict future disclosure. So if somebody in a workplace confides in someone and they shut it down, don't want to know about it, that person will adhere to those rules of silence. Whereas if you have a good first experience of disclosing, and you do that in a workplace context, then your willingness to accept help and to be supported increases. And we want to definitely encourage that. Workplaces can play massively important roles. People have friendships and relationships there. People might be in teams that are discussing other issues. And even if you're not openly discussing it, people can be clued into the signals around what's happening and if someone might be in need of help. So there's an opportunity that we want people to capitalise on, that is available in a workplace context. And we have seen through COVID what we're calling the shadow epidemic, the rise in domestic and family violence experiences. But we're seeing leading practice employers have kept their doors open for people who are experiencing those behaviours to still come to work. And I even know one organisation who created a fake project so that individuals could say that they were an essential worker. And they couldn't resolve the violence for that person, but what they could do was have a place where they were safe, an opportunity for them still to earn money, because we know financial violence is something that people experience. And there's so many other touch points, and it's just a missed opportunity. We live as social creatures in an ecosystem where work is really important. So, and I know most employers really want to do the right thing. So that's why we've embarked on those guidelines.
Sam, can I bring you in here as to what you might have to add to that, and whether Amnesty is looking at any similar programs or any work both here or abroad?
Not in exactly the same space that Lisa's been referencing, but certainly advocating strongly around women's rights in the gender inequality space, and as Lisa said, that's where domestic and family violence and sexual violence, that's where it starts. And so that's been the core elements of our advocacy, and also really strong advocacy for justice for survivors of both domestic and family violence and sexual violence.
Well, it's been an extraordinary time in our lives, and the figure now of the groundswell of high school girls speaking out about sexual assault by high school boys from neighbouring schools. It's now 5,000 girls have spoken out. It's giving us a bleak picture of really nothing changing, huge issues with consent, and the finger being pointed at our most elite boys' schools. How can we feel that hope is possible?
Look, I have enormous hope in young people, and I have enormous hope in young women and in the solidarity of young women. And whilst change has been slow to occur, there's always the old argument that are we just hearing more now, which is actually a good health indicator that people are talking more about it, but that can make it seem like we're not moving forwards and the incidences are more prevalent. But certainly it's a good sign that we are having conversations in more public forums. The work that you speak of that Chanel Contos brought to light in terms of the Instagram poll to advocate for schools to bring the conversation around consent earlier on into the curriculum, the support that she received in such rapid time is indicative, I think, of the strength of our young people to really bring people power to advocate for what they feel is important to them. And I think that's a really, really positive sign of hope.
Because the latest is that something like 100 principals of schools are having to meet and work out, well, what do we do and how do we bring parents to the table as well as obviously the students. Lisa, have
absolutely.
You been watching this development and social media being used as yet another strong agent for change?
I mean, absolutely, and I've been watching it with interest, not least because I have daughters who range from the ages of 16 to 23. I have 3 daughters in that precise group. I think, like Sam says, enormous hope in young people, but also, Philippa, you absolutely have to have hope. If you weren't optimistic about the future of humankind, you couldn't work in the spaces that we work in, because you wouldn't get up every day and do it. The reason Sam and I get up every day and do this is because we know change is possible, and because we know that change has to happen, and that there are enough people who want it to happen, and there are probably just as many other people who'd like it to happen but have no idea where to start. And I think that given that we have that on our side, we have no choice. The question is, how do we do it? Because we know that there have been public reckonings before, and I think we were all hopeful when the Me Too movement started that, apart from a few Hollywood movie producers and high-profile famous people, that there would be more of a revolution in terms of women's experiences, and that hasn't happened because I suppose every act of activism is just one act. You need many, 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 many acts to be able to try and create change, but you have to be optimistic. And I think that what Sam said about, well, the conversation is just about people opening up, but probably just because we're hearing lots of stories doesn't mean the situation's gotten worse. It's just meaning where people who are feeling more open and free to be able to have those conversations. And you know what? I've been working in this space a really long time, especially in the women's area. And you never would have had a national conversation around this 20 years ago. It just never would have made the front pages of the paper. No one cared. No one cared in mainstream media, and now it's a mainstream conversation, and that is progress.
Absolutely,
yes.
and Grace Tame's speech wouldn't have occurred in the press club.
Exactly.
Well, the people behind the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movement have brought hope that there would be change and greater equality, as you say. And while more women are speaking out, and Grace Tame is such an extraordinary beacon of hope, it still feels, and I suppose I come from a mainstream background, a mainstream media background, it still feels that change is glacially slow, and that women really face dreadful consequences for speaking out. And I think this is very raw for a lot of people at the moment with what's going on. But I suppose my question to both of you is, do you think these movements have brought substantial change? And I think, Lisa, you said it's just one action on top of another action. But is it just shedding light on issues, or is change actually starting to happen?
I firmly believe that we're at the start of a change process. As Lisa said, change is cyclical, and action builds on action builds on action. And certainly what we're seeing as the start of a change process in Australia and globally is an increase in the conversation and an increase in the number of people having the conversation. So we're building that people power, and we're standing in solidarity around these issues. Certainly change is slow, and one of the, I think, working in the human rights space is like a lesson in both patience and perseverance, because you need to consistently chip away in order to deliver change, and it always happens at a much slower pace than human rights defenders would like to see. Of course, we need more, and I think if we look in the Australian context, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women imposes an obligation on governments to take appropriate measures to guarantee the exercise and enjoyment of women's rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, the Australian government has obviously ratified the convention, but what we need now, the change we need here, is for our government to commit to systemic change, to ensure that equality becomes a reality in Australia. And that's from the military to Parliament House, right through our schools, our workplaces and our communities. And that's the change that we need to be advocating for at a national level.
And you have been advocating for that. And what kind of response do you get?
Look, as I said, human rights work is slow and an exercise in persistence. So it is about chipping away. It's about lobbying. It's about we receive, a good reception in Parliament in terms of opportunities to meet with members of Parliament and senators to discuss the issues that are really at the heart of their constituency, and certainly at the heart of Amnesty's work. And we'll continue to have those conversations.
Now, we're talking about the halls of power, and there's been a lot of talk of a trial by media, very contentious, a trial by public opinion in the last few days regarding serious allegations against Christian Porter, which he has strenuously denied repeatedly. Is there a chance that, or a risk that people power can turn into a mob mentality, and the issues are lost or undermined, and that it could be at the cost of a fair process? And I might add, a fair process for who? It doesn't necessarily mean a politician or someone who has spoken out. I'm just wondering about your thoughts there.
Oh, look, no, I don't. I actually would push back against that sentiment. I think that certainly I'm hearing calls for an independent inquiry with respect to the allegations around the attorney. And I really welcome the government appointment of Kate Jenkins, our Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner, to do an inquiry into workplace sexual harassment in Parliament, and that probably, I hope, will look quite similar to the one Liz Broderick did, a decade earlier on the Defence Force, and that, these are instruments with which to conduct an effective and thorough review, and I think that they are very, very welcome. In terms of mob mentality, it's the news this week. Will it be the news in a month? I'm a bit cynical because I think people talk about mob mentality, but actually most people have never taken sexual violence and sexual harassment against women seriously enough. And that's why women don't disclose. That's why most women never reveal what's happened to them. Most women who are on social media now sharing their stories are opening up with lines like, I've never shared this with anyone. I've lived with this for 20, 30 years. I think that I disagree that that's actually happening, and I think that what we'd like to see are effective processes, proper accountability, and the opportunity for women to be able to come forward with their views and with their experiences without the retribution. It was Brittany Higgins' fear, rightly so, that this would affect her career. So she wasn't worried about mob mentality. And so it's the victim that's often on trial here, the person alleging the complaint. So I don't think so, and I'm prepared to live with it.
And Sam, would you like to see greater leadership in terms of an independent inquiry? Would you like to see an inquiry of a different kind to what the Sex Discrimination Commissioner has been charged with looking into?
Yeah, I think that I completely agree with Lisa, and I think that that's a good step. And obviously this situation is complex, and Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks to the presumption of innocence, but we need to weigh that against the obligation to speak out when we see a situation that appears unjust, and there is plenty of evidence emerging day on day at the moment that would indicate to us that the situation certainly does appear unjust, and we would call for our leadership in government to call for an independent investigation into this matter particularly.
What is it about Australia? We look at we were doing pretty well on an OECD level in terms of women in the boardrooms, and now we seem to have slipped back. Lisa, what's the situation looking like today, and how would you compare it with, say, a decade ago?
It depends on what you're looking at.
ASX 200?
ASX 200 companies and women in leadership, it's bad. It's not good. It's quite pathetic, actually, when you think of, as I mentioned earlier, the educational attainment of women. Boards, we look better on boards, and the reason that boards reflect better gender representation than, say, executive management is because boards are accountable to regulatory authorities and they're accountable to shareholders, and it's probably easier to create change on a board because it's subject to, rejuvenation. But we still have, less than 30% of our boards of our top ASX companies are female. So even though we're doing better on boards, it's still only not even 30%. And in executive management, so the top teams of our listed organisations, these are the people who have all the power, we're still looking at, representation that's around the 20%. And, it's unthinkable in Australia in 2021 that there's not enough merit. I'm doing inverted commas when I say the word merit, because we all know merit is not a real thing, and I can talk about that ad infinitum. But the other interesting thing to say is that the only place where we've seen movement as reported by the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which is our census organisation, is in the middle management rank. So in the middle management rank, yes, we have seen movement in female representation, but not in executive leadership. And that really does need to change, because we know that once you get a critical mass of women in power, that you can then start to challenge the systems that were designed without them in mind. And you can't have that with a minority group.
Sam, is it different in other organisations, do you think, that leadership of women? If we're looking at the not-for-profit sector, is it different to, say, the ASX top listed companies?
Yeah, I think the not-for-profit sector comparatively is doing better. I just think that there is still a way to go, and I smiled when I heard Lisa talk about the need to challenge the structures and systems that were created without them in mind, and that that I think that that's relevant across all sectors. But on the whole, the not-for-profit sector in terms of gender equality, I think, tends to perform better.
And then we look at politics. I think the figures in the lower house in Canberra are something like 86 to 187. Can I just get your thoughts? Are you, either of you, considering a political career? Do you think politics at the moment is attractive at all to women?
Not even slightly.
No.
That's a big no from me.
Yeah, and neither am I. But I do think that what's important is that every area of our community has a role to play. So you've got the activist in Sam, you've got people who focus on business community in me, and the people who are in politics. They're people that we're both madly trying to influence all the time, and maybe they don't behave like activists, but you know what? They've got the power to change things from within. Even if they don't report it on social media, and that people come down criticising them for not being brave, for not being as vocal as they could be. Maybe that they play a different role in trying to change things from within. And sometimes it's really interesting when you listen to politicians once they've left politics and they reflect on what their challenges were and what they might have tried to do. I just think I think we all play a different role, and it's very important that we have the right people in politics to try and play their role.
Well, I was just hearing on, Patricia Carvelis, that a small number, but a significant number of women have decided not to recontest in the next election as a result of some of the culture of politics and Parliament House. What would you, and do we expect too much of women?
Well, I think whenever you're a member of a minority,
it's an incredibly.
I was just going to say, yeah, you go, Sam.
I just think that that's incredibly sad to hear, but perfectly understandable at the same time, that ultimately we owe it to ourselves to look after our health and well-being, and we need to determine when an environment is no longer a place that is conducive to being psychologically safe and well and healthy. And so I can appreciate how women may be making that decision. There is significant systemic and structural change that needs to happen in our political system, and I firmly believe we need more women in government and more young women, and I feel excited when I see young female leaders emerging and entering this space.
I do really hope, though, that if those women are not recontesting, that their political parties pre-select other women. I really hope that happens, because I think that would be. It would just be so excruciatingly disappointing to go backwards in this space.
It'd be a huge setback. And look, you head up the Diversity Council of Australia. Could you just describe that there are groups of women who experience greater gender inequality than others? The place is far easier. Australia is far easier in terms of the progression for many groups of women. Can I just ask you to talk about that and the issues around diversity and opportunity?
Well, it's a really good, thank you for asking that question, because I think we get used, and it's easier to talk about women as though they're a homogenous group, especially when we're trying to gather around a focal point, violence against women. But what's important to understand is that not all women experience things the same way. And what our research reveals is that affirmative action, for example, for women has only ever benefited women who have an Anglo-Celtic identity, who are cisgendered, straight, able-bodied people. So what we have to understand is that every deviation you have away from the main group, and in this case that group of women, it will be more complex to have access to opportunity and to have equal outcomes. Even something like sexual harassment. In the Human Rights Commission report that they put out a few years ago, it identified, for example, that lesbian and bisexual women experience sexual harassment at an amplified level and much more frequently than straight women, and that if you have a disability, it becomes exponential. And if you are culturally and linguistically diverse, again, you're more at risk of harassment. And that is true for to achieve any type of outcome of equity, to try and get into power, to try and close the gender pay gap, to try and, get appointed to a board. All of those barriers are exacerbated for First Nations women, for women with disabilities, for women who are LGBTIQ+, and for culturally diverse women. So even though it's complex to talk about women as a group that's not homogenous and it requires sophistication, we should try to, in our activism, in the work we try and do to create gender equalities, to try and remember that we're a broad church, and equity of outcome for one group of women, if you're leaving other women behind, isn't good enough, and that we need to try and hold forces amongst the whole sisterhood to ensure that we can all benefit from a more feminist future.
Because speaking out, if you don't have agency in your workplace about sexual harassment, which is so usually someone in a position of power, is just seen as career limiting and potentially career ending for so many women, even if they know others who have faced the same treatment from that person.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we did a piece of work last year we put out on class at work, and what we were able to identify is that someone's socioeconomic status, that when that is combined with gender, and because people who have privilege in our society, even for men, tend to be from a narrow pool of men as well, which is why a lot of men listen to diversity and inclusion or feminism, or the struggle for greater rights, and they feel excluded from that, and they think, well, I don't feel privileged, I don't feel empowered. And so we have to recognise that even for men, they have exclusion if they fit into any of those other categories, and actually privilege benefits a very narrow group of men as well. However, having said that, they do all seem to be in charge, and they're running all our organisations, and they're in government. So they're the ones we have to convince for the betterment of everyone, including men. Actually, men benefit from a feminist future.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, we've covered that sort of, I think I just want to get back to this idea of people power, because that's the theme, and what it means to you, and what can we as individuals do to contribute to gender equality?
I firmly believe in the power of any one person to make a change. but we are very clearly and obviously stronger together. So for me, people power is about joining our voices in a way that we can't easily be ignored. So it's essentially people coming together in solidarity to apply pressure for change. And we can do that through, letter writing, through signing petitions, through protest, through participating in public debate, polls on social media. There are so many opportunities for us to be advocates physically and in the digital fora these days that there's lots of opportunity for us to stand in solidarity and to take action and to apply pressure for change.
And Sam, can I ask you, what examples would you give of some of those campaigns that Amnesty International Australia has run that have got some results or are looking really encouraging?
Sure. Well, we could be here all night, thankfully, talking about this. And this is, again, one of the things that Lisa mentioned at the outset, that the human rights wins are also one of the ways that we maintain hope by chipping away and by celebrating when we have some wins. So I'll just go through a couple from 2020. And interestingly, one of them commenced for us in International Women's Day last year, where we attended Canberra to the Iranian embassy and presented petitions on behalf of Yasamin Ariani, who campaigned alongside her mother for an end to Iran's compulsory veiling laws. For that, she was imprisoned with her mum and sentenced to 16 years in prison. After over 1 million Amnesty supporters from around the world, including 100,000 here in Australia, signed a petition calling for her release, the Tehran Appeals Court reduced the prison sentence from 16 years to 5 years and 6 months. Now, obviously, we firmly believe Yasamin should not have served any time. However, it's a good demonstration of people power that 1 million people was too many people to ignore, and subsequently her sentence was reduced. In December 2020, Argentina finally legalised abortions after a grassroots feminist movement mobilised hundreds of thousands of women in Argentina, and Amnesty lent our voice to that campaign after a similar bill failed in 2018. We have become very active in mobilising alongside women's rights organisations and empowering women's human rights defenders. And this has meant that contraceptives and family planning clinic consultations became free of charge in Burkina Faso, that pregnant girls were allowed to attend school in Sierra Leone, and in December 2020, Denmark finally amended their criminal code to recognise that sex without consent is rape, in line with the international human rights standards. And this change followed years of campaigning by women's rights and survivor groups. So we know that when we stand together as one to call for change, that we can create a world where women's rights are more respected.
Yeah. And Lisa, would you like to telegraph some of the successes of the Diversity Council of Australia?
Well, I mean, it's hard for us to measure directly what our successes are, because our work is essentially to develop research and evidence that supports the building of capability amongst business leaders to improve outcomes for diverse groups in Australia. But I'm really proud of the work we've done around First Nations people, employment, and their having them flourish more in Australian workplaces, on the pressure we continue to put on organisations around improving their capability, around how they engage with women and how they build flexible workplaces that enable people with caring responsibilities to continue to have flourishing careers, on the fact that Australian workplaces more and more are signing up to this idea of shared care parental leave. More and more Australian workplaces are having their men engage with gender equality, and that more and more Australian workplaces are now starting to take more seriously issues around racism and issues around the inclusion of people from culturally diverse and linguistically diverse backgrounds in Australia. And the fact that the membership of our organisation continues to grow, and at the moment, 20% of Australian employees are in workplaces that are members of the Diversity Council, and the fact that didn't drop off during COVID, where we thought it might, shows that more and more the business community is engaged on this issue. I very rarely have to go into an Australian workplace and tell them why they should care about this. Very, very rarely. And that was not true even 10 years ago. And it's certainly not true in the public domain. But I'm really proud, actually, of how much the corporate sector does champion a lot of these causes. We certainly saw that with marriage equality, that they were really significant. And more we're seeing the corporate sector getting behind even the call for constitutional recognition of First Nations people. So whilst I can't absolutely link an outcome to something we've done, I know that there's a groundswell in the business community for diversity and inclusion.
And do you think that the business community is doing better than government, individuals, not-for-profits? How would you call it?
Yeah, I can definitely say that the business community is doing better than government, but that's not very hard because I struggle to find an employer who would have and ahed about doing an investigation into an allegation and to alleged behaviour, even if the evidence was skint. I can't imagine an employer not taking it. I mean, some employers don't take it seriously, but by and large, that's a battle that's been won by a lot of workplaces because the employers are keen on managing risk.
Yes.
So yes, I think that the work, and they have more scrutiny in lots of ways because they're directly accountable to shareholders and customers, and their reputation, once tarnished, is very hard to get back. And they also have a groundswell of people inside their workplaces who are demanding better, and there's a war for talent. So there's all these motivating forces for workplaces. In terms of the not-for-profit sector, look, not-for-profit employers are employers. And like any other industry, they have some really outstanding players and they have organisations that are dragging their heels. But I think by and large, the rising tide is lifting all boats. So I think that the employment sector is doing much better.
And Sam, we're wrapping up now, and I just love your thoughts on what gives you hope and where you might see the big battles ahead.
I think the big battles ahead are definitely aligned to the change that's required to systems and structures. So we need to use our voice to really challenge the systemic gender inequality. And I agree with Lisa that in our political environment, that has a long, long way to go. But what gives me hope? Young people give me hope. Young women. Women in general and the solidarity of women gives me hope. People power absolutely gives me hope. The growing support and awareness, the increase in public conversation, and also, as I said, the human rights wins. Seeing, a campaign come to produce results that are life-changing and life-saving for many women across the globe.
And Lisa, what gives you hope, and what do you see as the big frontiers going forward?
Well, I receive hope the same way that Sam does, although I have to say that every time I spend any time with people from Amnesty International Australia, I walk away thinking we can change the world. And that gives me enormous hope because they are phenomenal individuals, the people that Sam leads in that organisation. What gives me hope? Again, I think I'm a hopeful person, so I get hope every day. I receive hope because I see that every day people are angry about the status quo, and I feel hopeful when I see that. And in terms, what was the second part of your question? I think you asked me something else.
What do you see as the big frontiers, the big challenges to be had?
Yeah, it hasn't changed for me. I think that there are 4 key pillars in the feminist agenda. One is that women need the right to control their own bodies, and I think that globally that's a right that we need to absolutely pay attention to. We need equal pay for work of equal value, and even in Australia, even though the pay gap reduced by 1% a couple of weeks ago, it's still, a pay gap of 14% is still not great. We need equal representation in power, leadership, etc. And we need to have a sharing of the care, that caring responsibilities and domesticity needs to be shared within relationships, because we know that that's a liberating force for women, but we also know that it's important for people to define themselves as complete human beings, and that includes men. So they're my 4 areas.
Look, thank you very much, both of you, Klintworth and Lisa Annese. I'd like to conclude by calling upon Pauline Wright, President of the New South Wales Council of Civil Liberties for Civil Liberties, and a valuable board member of Affinity Intercultural Foundation, to present the closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Philippa, and good evening to all of our distinguished viewers. I'm sure you'll all agree that Affinity's collaboration tonight with Amnesty International Australia and the Diversity Council of Australia was a fitting tribute to the importance of International Women's Day. What these institutions have in common is a consistent and effective commitment to many things, but specifically tonight to the promotion of gender equality, inclusion and empowerment for every woman, no matter her origin, not only on this critical day, but on every day of the year. Although women have made extraordinary contributions throughout history, those have all too often gone unremarked. But we are, I believe, at a turning point, and it's discussions like these that bring us hope for the future. I'd like to sincerely thank tonight's inspiring activists for equality and harmony, Sam Klintworth and Lisa Annese. And thanks must also go to Philippa McDonald for so generously and effectively facilitating the discussion tonight. And I'd also like to thank Professor Mary Crock for her warm introduction. And of course, Ahmet Polat and the team at Affinity, who continue to work tirelessly to promote intercultural exchange in the interests of creating a more connected and a more inclusive society. Around the globe, to a greater or lesser extent, women have historically been subject to marginalisation, injustice, disempowerment, and exclusion from positions of power, to say nothing of determination over their own bodies. Societies have too often deemed them as lesser than men, stripping them of the rights and freedoms that should be guaranteed to all of humanity, including the rights to education, free speech, property, safety. And we see from science to engineering to law, sports, the arts, and to religion, it's essential for society's health that women's ideas and experiences should equally influence the design and application of the innovations that are going to shape our societies in the future. The way women's rights are respected and enforced are indicators of where that society stands in terms of universal human values and the rule of law. We just can't afford to ignore any longer the mistreatment of women and girls around the globe. Far too many girls and women continue to experience violence and abuse, as well as unjust treatment before the law, or in employment, or in social interactions. From female genital mutilation and cutting in Sudan, to human trafficking in Thailand, from child marriages in Niger to female children being denied an education in Mali, to the alarming rates of sexual assault in the Congo, making it the rape capital of the world, from the 6,000 innocent mothers and 700 babies in Turkey who were prisoners of conscience, to the 300 schoolgirls abducted in Nigeria. and the Rohingya women who are struggling to survive, to the detained leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and the seemingly endless list just goes on. But Australia is no exception. As we've heard tonight, Australia has alarming rates of domestic violence, and sexual harassment against women in the workplace seems to be just endemic, reaching even to the High Court of Australia. And as mentioned tonight, we've recently heard those very serious allegations of sexual assault within Parliament House from Brittany Higgins, and a historical rape allegation against the Federal Attorney General, an allegation he has vigorously denied. Given that the key witness has died, it is what happens now to address that allegation that will count in terms of our commitment as a nation to respect for women's rights. We need leadership on this issue. International Women's Day gives us an opportunity to reflect on the road ahead, what remains to be done in our quest for gender equality, and how we might harness our collective energy. The kinds of changes that women have fought for and made have been improvements, as we've heard tonight, not only for women, but for our community as a whole. It benefits men too. When we talk about the progress of women, we're talking about the progress of Australia. Without a critical mass of women in our parliaments and our boardrooms, decisions made in these forums are impoverished. For so long as women's voices remain unheard in all walks of life, our society and institutions will fail to reach their full potential. So let us all work together towards a world where women are equal partners with men in all aspects of life, where women are able to work independently with equal pay, and where all women live their lives free from discrimination, harassment and violence. Finally, I'd like to share with you some information about Affinity's upcoming webinars in partnership with NGO CSW. These webinars hope to inform, engage and inspire grassroots efforts and advocacy needed to empower women and girls. Firstly, on Thursday, the 18th of March at 9:30 a.m, the UN Youth Australia New South Wales Division, along with the Journalists and Writers Foundation, present young women leaders in the 21st century. So that should be a really great event. And secondly, on the 24th of March, Wednesday at 9:30 a.m, the Institute for Economics and Peace, along with the Journalists and Writers Foundation, will present Women as Catalysts for Peace. So if you want to find out more, just head to Affinity's webpage, affinity.org.au. So thank you all. Thank you, distinguished viewers, for your time, and thank you to all of our team and the speakers tonight.